Good afternoon. Welcome to the FCCJ. I'm your moderator, Andy Sharp from Nikkei Asia. So we've got the election coming up on Sunday, and I'm sure everyone's watching this very closely and preparing reports about the poll. So I will not go into that detail too much right now. First thing I'll do is introduce our speakers, who have very kindly come today at short notice to speak about their views and predictions for the election. Our first speaker is immediately to my right. It's Professor Kensuke Takayasu. He's the director at the Center for Asian and Pacific Studies at Seikei University in Tokyo. And he'll talk a little bit about the fragmentation of the opposition and also their coordination at this election. And next to him is the second speaker today. That's going to be Kenneth Mori McElwain. I struggled with the Scottish-sounding name more than the Japanese name. He's going to talk about basically a forecast for the election and the current trends that we're going to be seeing going into this election on Sunday. Sorry, Kenneth.
I'm talking about COVID.
You're talking about COVID, yeah.
Yes.
Sorry, my bad. Kenneth is going to talk about how COVID is going to feed into this election and how people vote. And finally is great pleasure to have Takuma Oohamazaki. He's an election consultant at his company, JAG Japan. And he is going to talk about his forecast and the current trends. And I know from following him online that he watches all the numbers and very, very closely. So it could be very interesting to see what his sources are telling him. So each speaker will speak for around 10 minutes. Then we'll open this up for Q&A. Takayasu-san will speak in Japanese in English.
Just to start with.
Sorry, I'm messing this up already. He's speaking in English just to start with, as will Professor McElwain, and then Oohamazaki-san will speak in Japanese with interpretation from our very own Mary Joyce over there in the corner as our interpreter. So, without further ado, Takayasu-san, can you start, please?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this prestigious place. I understand I'm supposed to provide you, to start with some perspectives on the coming lower house election in Japan. The first point I should like to draw your attention to is the low turnout in the recent general elections. In 2014, the turnout was 52.7%, and in 2017, it was 53.7%, two of the lowest turnouts in post-war Japan. Previously, the lowest turnout had been 59.7% in 1993. In contrast, in 2005, when Koizumi faced the country, it went up to 67.5%, and the following election in 2009, the Democratic Party of Japan, DPJ, won the election with a turnout of 69.3%. Many of the electorate had distanced themselves from the general election in the last few years. Whether this trend continues or not is a matter of interest. The turnout has certain implications for our democracy, but the point I want to raise here is its implication for Japan's party politics. Let me, for a moment, refer to some numbers, which are the votes obtained by the LDP in the proportional representation of the lower house elections. The votes gained by the LDP in 2009, 12, 14, and 17 had been around 18 million, 16 million, 17 million, and 18 million, respectively. There's a mildly upward trend in the last 10 years, but the result of the 2017 election has just caught up with that in 2009, when the LDP disastrously lost against the DPJ. The huge victory for the LDP in 2005 had brought them nearly 26 million votes, while votes in 2003 for the LDP had been around 20 million, when they had actually come behind the DPJ in the PR bloc. So even though the LDP is winning big in recent elections, their support in the country is not necessarily high, historically speaking. their victory is indeed led by the setback of the oppositions. So the recent low turnout could be argued to be the result of the electorate's disenchantment with the opposition parties and the LDP missing its opportunity to recover its loss since 2009. Whether political parties can attract voters to the ballot box, particularly the opposition parties, should naturally affect the result of the election. The second point of interest is the fragmentation and some cooperation amongst the opposition parties. Post-war Japan had a long history of divided left-wing parties between the socialists and the communists, like in France, while since the mid-1990s the main opposition party to the LDP had struggled to position itself somewhere between center-left and center-right in Japanese politics. They managed to come under the umbrella of the DPJ in 2003, but the coalition was not easy to maintain. Meanwhile, a local force in Osaka arose later to create a national party, the Japan Restoration Party, Nippon Ishin no Kai, a sort of right-wing party. This fragmentation was partly facilitated by the electoral system, but what was important was that it did give the LDP an easy ride in the Diet and the national elections. The LDP could exploit their rivalry and play around the opposition parties, making them fight against each other. Therefore, the cooperation of 5 of the opposition parties is a change, considering the recent trend. The Constitutional Democratic Party, the main opposition party now, managed to secure electoral cooperation and candidate coordination with the Communist Party, the Democratic Party for the People, the Social Democratic Party, and Leiwa, the new left-wing party, in over 70% of the single seat constituencies. Now, one predominant dividing line in Japanese electoral politics was whether you supported the LDP or were against it, whatever they stood for. The fragmentation of the opposition parties naturally split the protest votes against the mighty LDP. So theoretically, candidate coordination in individual constituencies should benefit these parties. The LDP is thus understandably attempting to discredit such coordination by demonizing the Communist Party and cooperation with them, although the LDP themselves have asked help in the elections for over 20 years from Komeito, a rather very different type of political party from themselves. Whether the electorate will appreciate such coordination, or whether they will agree with LDP and others' assertion, shall certainly affect the turnout and thus the result of the election. It is a great shame that the campaign period is so short, and there are very few chances for the electorate to examine various allegations on all parties and listen to their own explanations. Having said that, even with such candidate coordination, still the opposition parties are fighting against one another. Although the 5 opposition parties have coordinated their candidates in many constituencies, Ishin's candidates have stood in around 70 of such seats. And in other 70-odd seats, the 5 opposition parties have failed to coordinate their candidates and hence fighting against each other, in some cases with Ishin's candidates in addition. Ishin is an interesting party. They have a stronghold in Osaka. Although it is often classified as an opposition party, it might be helpful to group them separately from the other opposition parties, as they were closer to the LDP, voting with them in the Diet on many occasions. Ishin was keener to attack the DPJ's successor parties and the Communist Party rather than the governing LDP, although policy-wise there were areas which overlapped with those of other opposition parties. They, of course, needed government support for their local policies, including the failed Osaka Metropolis Plan and Expo in Osaka. Anyhow, what I wish to explain here is that the election results shall still create fragmented opposition parties. The third point I want to raise is the aftermath of Sunday's election. Whether the LDP can be in government depends on whether they can secure a majority by themselves or with the help of other parties, by which I mean Komeito and Ishin. If the LDP has to ask Ishin for help, it shall create a tension, not small, with Komeito. However, this would put Ishin in a much more easily comprehensible position in the party system. It looks like Ishin will increase its seat, and if that is the case, and if they are still kept out of government, party competition will be further complicated. Ishin seem to be critical against Kishida-san, at least at this moment, but they have supported LDP's previous policies and attacked other opposition parties as mentioned. Hence, we may see Ishin criticizing the government but still supporting its legislation, while they fiercely attack other opposition parties, which would naturally confuse the electorate. The less likely result of the election is the DPJ with others gaining majority, which could cause strong tension to set up a government facing a twisted diet in addition. More realistically, if they can increase their seats, they could build on that, and possibly the recent style of politics, namely the lack of explanation, misleading the diet, bullying inside government, may have a chance to change, as more pressure will be put on government. For the DPJ and others, whether they can maintain the cooperation until next year's upper house election is something very important, as 32 of the 124 seats will be decided by the first-past-the-post system yet again. Nonetheless, there are plenty of problems to keep the cooperation alive. Politics will focus on next year's upper house election, and so the campaign shall carry on. I must mention one concern about Japan's electoral politics, which I have touched on. People were not given the time to discuss and learn about policies, and indeed government performance over the last 8 or 9 years. We were allowed more information about the LDP's future plans during their long presidential election and afterwards. But the opposition parties did not enjoy the same benefit. The effective campaign period this time is the shortest in post-war Japan, only 17 days, compared with the 40 days in 2009. Japanese politics could be more careful in ensuring a level playing field for political parties, the deficiency of which could create a grave concern to our democracy. This general election could have been a chance to review not only the government's responses to the pandemic, but also foreign policy, gender policy, its fiscal and monetary policy, social policy, health policy, family policy, energy policy, environment policy for the last 8 or 9 years. Yet unfortunately, it seems that we're going to miss this very significant opportunity. Well, thanks very much. That's all from me.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Takayasu Sensei. Okay, we'll move on now to McElwain Sensei. You're going to talk about the pandemic and its effect on the election, right?
Absolutely. And let me open up my slides. I have not used a PC in a while, so let's see how this goes. I see. All right, hopefully that's showing on the screens. Thank you very much. I'm Kenneth Mori McElwain from the University of Tokyo. I'm originally from Ireland, so you're going to see a lot of green and orange and white flag-themed colors throughout my presentation. I want to talk about 2 things today. The first is, and I realize I cannot actually see the screen on this PC, so I'll be looking along with you. The first is relating to COVID, and actually most of what I'll talk about relates to how Japanese voters have perceived the government's coronavirus response. Japan has certainly done better than a lot of other advanced industrialized democracies, certainly compared to Western Europe and North America. But what a series of surveys that our research team has been conducting for the last 1.5 years has shown is that most of the credit for COVID response has been going to local officials, particularly governors, not to the national government. That's certainly been true under Abe and Suga. What remains to be seen is whether that'll continue under Kishida. And the second point, I'll only touch on briefly, in part because Takayasu Sensei has explained it so carefully, is what to expect about voter turnout. And I'll just point out one thing, which is this is the first election in 3 to 4 cycles where the election districts themselves have not changed. And that provides a certain level of continuity, which may improve voter turnout. So let me talk about COVID first. So our research team at the Institute of Social Science at the University of Tokyo has been conducting survey waves once every 2 to 3 months relating to how voters perceive how elite actors have responded to COVID. And in our surveys, we ask how well have various actors done during COVID, and we ask them to rate it on a 5-point scale, where 3 means neutral, 5 means very good, 1 means very poor. And the left panel shows data, I believe, from May 2020, so under Suga, the first state of emergency, and the second is from March 2021. Under Suga. So the first is Abe, the second is Suga. And what you may notice is that there's almost no change between the two. National leaders, for the most part, have not been rated as highly as have governors. Doctors are rated the most positively. Medical experts, these would be people who belong to varying government advisory councils, don't do too well. The prime ministers are rated roughly equally to the media, which is either good for the media or I don't know how to put it exactly, but certainly the prime ministers have not done as well as the governors. But of course there's variation among governors, as you would expect, based on how well their prefectures have responded. And I apologize, I'll actually just jump to this slide. It's, what we've done is we've divided our survey respondents into the prefectures in which they reside. And what this figure shows is, first, the difference between the rating for the prime minister and the rating for their governor. So a positive value to the right means that the prime minister is rated more positively. A negative value to the left means that the governor is rated more positively. And I've further divided the sample, our survey samples, into those who declare themselves to be LDP supporters. That's the panel on the right. And those who do not support the LDP. So all non-LDP respondents who are on the left. And as you'd expect, there are more positive scores among LDP supporters. But even so, in the vast majority of prefectures, really outside of Nara, the governors are seen as having done a better job during COVID. But these are surveys that we've been doing, again, over the past year and a half. The one that I just showed you is from March earlier this year. And the situation with COVID has changed quite a bit, certainly in the last month, as COVID case counts have been declining quite rapidly. And I think what remains for this election is whether or not voters think that we're still in COVID, the Wizu Corona, or are we approaching post-COVID? And this framing makes a difference because it'll affect what type of policies voters will want other than COVID. And broadly speaking, I'm talking about more growth-enhancing policies versus policies that address socioeconomic inequalities and redistribution. And so this is data from a survey that we did earlier in October, actually September 30th till October 3rd. And in that survey, we asked respondents to pick the top 3 issues that they're concerned about leading up to this election that we're facing on Sunday. I've also divided the respondents into those who support left-wing parties, so that would be the Constitutional Democratic Party, Democratic Party for the People, Reiwa, Social Democrats, and the Communists. We have independents on the middle column, and then the LDP on the right. LDP respondents were about 30% of our sample. The left is about 15%, and the remainder are primarily independents. And the first point is that among all groups, the top policy concern is COVID. But it's stronger among left-wing party supporters, it's moderate among independents, and lowest among the LDP. I've also listed in brackets the percentage that listed in anywhere in their top 3 priorities. So outside of the brackets is their top 1. Inside the brackets is their top 3. And again, on the left, about half the voters include COVID. Among the LDP, it's about a third, which is either a lot when you think about it as a dominant policy, but it also means that 2/3 of LDP voters aren't really that concerned about COVID anymore. Now, I've highlighted the other policy issues that they've listed in order by their partisan affiliation. The ones in orange are what I would broadly construe to be more social welfare redistributive policies. So pension, healthcare is one, education, childcare is another. And perhaps somewhat predictably, the left cares more about socioeconomic inequalities and social welfare provisions, while the right cares more about economic growth and foreign and security policy. I've also listed the percentage that notes that the Constitution is their top priority. And I'll come back to this a little bit later, but in contrast to previous elections, that percentage has fallen, certainly compared to 2017, when blocking constitutional amendment animated a lot of the opposition parties, and certainly justified the Constitutional Democratic Party's creation. So I'm just going to show you one more figure using this survey. And what I've done is broken down the top policy priority of voters by their age group. And I'm showing both COVID and education/childcare. With COVID, perhaps given the greater health risks, it's no surprise that older voters care the most. But what's really striking, and the policy where the age difference is most clear, is on education and childcare, particularly among voters in their 30s. Now, parties that can emphasize this point, I think, offer not a solution, an option to voters who may be disenchanted with the current government with regard to those policy areas. And so let me end on this, or at least with relation to COVID, let me end here. Are we with COVID or post-COVID? And we still have to wait a little bit, but among independents, at least, there's still concerns about COVID, of course. We're all concerned about COVID, but the welfare dimension may be a way for the left-wing parties to win their attention. I'll speak very briefly about turnout. Actually, let me skip this and really get to the heart of the matter. One more slide. I'm jumping around. Here we go. So, given urbanization of Japan, there's been a gradual shift in the concentration of voters to urban areas from rural areas. The government has not always kept pace by reapportioning seats or redrawing district boundaries so that there is a vote seat proportionality across electoral districts. Currently, the law mandates that the population disparity between the most and least populated districts has to be within 2 to 1. But the practice has been that every time there's an apportionment, you make sure that it's about 1.95 to 1. So just under the line that must be met, but that also means in 5 to 10 years, the population has shifted once more. The result of this is that in both 2014 and 2017, there have been major realignments of district boundaries. And particularly in 2017, approximately a third of electoral districts, which comprise about a third of all voters in Japan, their boundaries were redrawn or seats were allocated to different prefectures. So this matters for democratic accountability and opposition coordination in 3 ways. The first is it's very difficult to cast your vote if you can't judge the incumbent, meaning you were under one incumbent, but in the next election, you're voting for a completely different set of candidates. The second is that it makes candidate coordination much harder for the opposition. You may be planning to coordinate in one electoral district, but when the boundaries are redrawn, all of a sudden you have to appeal to different sets of voters, and different incumbents who are already there may not want to step down. The third is there are high costs for information gathering. As Takayasu said, election campaigning is very abbreviated in Japan, and certainly in this contest, only 17 days since dissolution. But if boundaries are redrawn, it means that voters have to spend more time learning about parties, the candidates' personal qualities, as well as who they think is going to be best. And overall, in research I've been doing, redistricting reduces turnout 2 to 4%, and is particularly larger in urban districts. So with that in mind, for this election, I'll end here. I think there are a number of reasons that turnout may increase. The first is because of stable electoral districts, we think that voters will know the candidates better, and I think it's also helped opposition coordination. There's also less election fatigue. This is the first lower house election in 4 years, but really over the past decade or so, there's been some type of major election, either to the lower house, the House of Representatives, the House of Councilors, or the local elections. And that requires parties to expend money. It tires out your volunteers and other supporters. And so the time lag between the last major national election in 2019, the upper house, may increase voter mobilization in general. But I'm pessimistic on 2 points. The first, again, is a short campaign period. But the other point is, I think, as Takayasu said, opposition coordination makes sense if your goal is to beat the LDP. However, unlike 2017, it's not clear that there is one single policy that voters will understand that will justify ideologically the coalition between the communists and the constitutional Democrats. In 2017, constitutional reform did that, but that, as I showed earlier with the survey data, that seems to be less present on voters' minds. And ultimately, the sense that this is a coalition based on convenience rather than conviction may turn some of those voters towards, even voters who may not support the LDP, towards third options like Ishin. Let me end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Quick question there, just a very small point. What happened in Nara?
I don't know. I have a colleague who's from Nara, and he tells me that the governor is unpopular, but he also lives in Tokyo now, so doesn't quite know.
Okay.
Maybe time for field work.
It's a small point. I don't think it's going to affect the national election anyway. Okay, on to Oohamazaki-san, who's going to talk about his forecasts for the election. I know he crunches the numbers, does a lot of his own research, and trends going into the election. Thank you.
日本語で失礼いたします。はじめまして、選挙プランナーの大浜崎と申します。
So hello, I will be speaking in Japanese today. I'm an election campaign planner, and my name is Oohamazaki.
本日このような場にお招きいただきまして誠にありがとうございます。
Thank you very much for inviting me to be here on this opportunity.
プレゼンテーションのちょっと用意させていただきますね。
And I'll just get the presentation slides ready.
今開きます。ごめんなさい。待ちました。はい、多分大丈夫です。
一生懸命考えてます。
考えてますね。スライドショーに。あれ。なんか全画面でいきたいんだけど、
それかも右下のボタンを押したらそれの一番右ですか。そこまで右ではなくて、ごめんなさい。これか。
来てるのは来てるんですけど、ちょっと反応が遅いですよ。
お、行きましたね。
行きました。
ただ見えないという。
あれ。
あれ。
来ましたね。はい。大変失礼いたしました。
Excuse us for that.
科学的なご説明、学術的なご説明は高安先生、マッケルウェイン先生がたくさんしていただいたと思うので、より泥臭い選挙現場からの現状についてお話しできればと思います。
So we have had quite a thorough and very accurate explanation now from both Mr. Takayasu and also Mr. McElwain as well. So I would like to speak more about how things are on the field at the moment, really, on the ground in the election campaign.
まず議席予測についてですけれども、解散時の議席から私が今、ヤフーニュースというニュース媒体にオーサーとして参加しているので、そこで出させていただいた数字と、最新の産経新聞の数字が以下の通りです。
So first of all, I would like to speak about a forecast for the seats in this election as well. And on this slide here, we can see that I am working as an author with the Yahoo News, the news site. You can see the forecast which I published there prior to the announcement of the election, and also on the bottom, the forecast from Seikei.
新聞各紙によって数字はややばらつきがあるんですけれども、産経新聞が公示後に出した数字と私の数字は非常に近しいものになっていることがお分かりになるかと思います。
So each of the different newspapers have quite differences or discrepancies in regards to their forecast for this particular election. However, we can see that the forecast from Seikei, which was published after the election campaign had already begun, and my own forecast, which is listed here, are rather close.
新聞各紙によって数字ばらついているとは申し上げましたものの、自民党が単独で過半数を取ることは可能な情勢、また与党で過半数を取ることはもうほぼ間違いない情勢だという認識は報道各社のコンセンサスだと理解しています。
And so while there are differences in the forecasts and the predictions by each of the newspapers and so on, we can see that within each of these numbers, it does seem that the LDP will be rather possible in regards to being able to gain a majority on its own. And we can see that it is also rather unlikely or difficult for the minority or the opposition parties, to gain a majority on their own as well. This is largely held as the consensus by each of the different major media.
スライドに出させていただいたのは公示日にジャパンタイムズに取り上げていただいた私の見解でして、自民党が小選挙区で166議席、比例代表で70議席という予想を出しております。
And so we can see on the slide here, these are my predictions which were published in the Japan Times on the day of the announcement of the election, showing here an expectation that the LDP would retain 236 seats, and of these, 166 would be in single seat and 70 in the proportional representation.
この公示の時点での予測では、公明党を足して与党で265議席ということですので、いわゆる絶対安定多数を与党は確保するという見立てを私は19日の時点ではしています。
And so within this as well, I said in combination with the coalition party Komeito, assuming that they would be together obtaining 265 seats, allowing them to retain a stable majority. This was my predictions as of October the 19th.
ここまでは新聞各社の報道とかでしたが、現実問題として、この今、選挙戦に入ってからの現場の肌感覚についてもお話ししていきたいと思います。
And so until now, these have been the figures according to the various newspaper reporting and surveys and so on. From here, I would like to speak to the trends that I see on the ground within the election campaigning at the moment and how this really feels directly.
岸田内閣の支持率は内閣設立当初から下降傾向にあり、各社の報道によっては支持率と不支持率が拮抗している状態です。
And so the Kishida cabinet's approval rating started out at the beginning slightly lower than other previous cabinets has been, and we have seen since the election period has been continuing, according to the reporting in the various media and so on, has been continuing on a downward trend.
選挙期間中に行われた参議院の補欠選挙、静岡県選挙区では与党が敗北しました。
The upper house supplementary or by-elections in Shizuoka, which occurred during this election campaign, led to a defeat of the LDP.
もともと自民党の議員が辞職したものによるものですから、これは敗北してはならないもので、自民党の党本部もこれは落としてはいけないという認識でしたが、結果的に落選になったことは大きなダメージになっています。
This was led, or the by-election was held as a result of an LDP person stepping down, and therefore the LDP, the party headquarters, saw that this was a seat that they could not afford to lose, that they had to hang on to. However, there was the unexpected loss there as well, which was rather damaging for the LDP.
与野党で拮抗している小選挙区の数はおよそ80と見ています。
There are close to or around 80 different electorates where the ruling and opposition parties are now in a close match.
あさってが投開票日ですが、直前になってもですね、拮抗している選挙区に関しては、この金曜、土曜の2日間でも情勢が変わる可能性は少なくありません。
And so it is, of course, just the day after tomorrow is the day of the election. So being so immediately before the date, we are not expecting that it will be likely that there will be a significant change in the situation in these very close constituencies in the next 2 days over Saturday and Sunday.
与党の議席は新聞各社によって40から50議席ほどのばらつきがありますけれども、私個人としてはこのばらつきの中でも与党がやや低い数字、すなわち議席が少ない方に触れるのではないかというふうに考えています。
Within the reporting in the major newspapers in regards to the LDP, we are seeing a difference in, or sort of about 40 to 50 seats. My personal perspective on this is that this will be somewhat on the lower side of the number of seats.
続いて野党です。
Next, I would like to speak about the opposition.
野党共闘自体は一定の効果を生み出しており、野党それぞれの支持率は高くないにもかかわらず、小選挙区自体では検討しています。
The coordination or cooperation between the opposition parties is indeed producing some kind of results, and we are seeing that even though the approval ratings for the opposition parties are not necessarily so high, they are doing rather well in some of the primary election or the single seat constituencies.
高安先生、バッケルベン先生と同じで、私も維新に注目をしていますけれども、与党に批判的で野党に批判的な方々が日本維新の会に投票する傾向が見られます。
And as similar to also Professor Takayasu and Professor McElwain, I am also paying great attention to Ishin in this election as well. We are seeing that voters who are critical of both the ruling party and the opposition are actually having a tendency toward voting for Ishin this time.
この理由として与党が自民党総裁選で高市候補が出たように右傾化している状態、また野党共闘によって立憲共産党と揶揄されるように左傾化する、この左と右に二極化したことで真ん中の層、ミドルが空いていることが日本維新の会の躍進の理由だと考えています。
And the reason that I see for this is that we saw with the presence of Ms. Takaichi in the presidential race for the LDP, demonstrating or giving people the opinion that the LDP was indeed leaning further toward the right. Then we're seeing the cooperation between the Constitutional Democratic Party and the Japanese Communist Party showing a leaning toward the left of the opposition parties. This polarization between the left and right is therefore leaving a gap in the middle, and the people who are reaching for indeed this middle ground are leaning toward Ishin.
維新の会を野党に含めるならば、いずれにせよ、今週に入ってから野党の方が勢いはあると見ています。
So if we do include Ishin indeed within the opposition parties, as we are looking at the trends we are seeing in this final week of the election campaign, there is clearly a momentum on the part of the opposition.
その他気づいたことについてもお話ししたいと思います。
I would like to speak about some of the other points I have noticed at the moment.
国内の報道各社の女性調査の数字には相当なばらつきがあります。
There is significant discrepancy in regards to the numbers from the different domestic media surveys and so on.
これは各社の調査の方法が携帯電話、RDD の手法などさまざまな手法を試しているからですが、一方でこの結果がどのように選挙の結果と一致するかというところ、大変興味深く関心を持っています。
And the reason for this is there have been various changes in the survey methods of these different survey companies as to whether to the mobile phone and so on as well. What kind of impact this will have, first of all, in regards to the predictions, but also in the actual results of the election is something that we will be paying attention to.
ネット上での選挙戦についても触れたいと思います。
I'd like to also speak about the election campaigning online.
SNS 上でのいわゆるネガティブキャンペーンが自民党総裁選では大変話題になりました。
During the LDP presidential campaign, so-called negative campaigning on social media was a great topic of discussion.
一方、総選挙前にはいわゆる脱皮と呼ばれる問題が報道でも取り上げられたことで、ネガティブキャンペーンはこの総選挙中非常に少なくなっています。
However, at the same time, we have seen that prior to the beginning of the general election, discussions in regards to this has led to a decrease in the number of more radical posts and this kind of negative campaigning on social media.
脱皮の報道を含めてネガティブキャンペーンが取り上げられたことが抑止力になっていると見ています。
And we see that this kind of media reporting about these issues and so on is forming some kind of a deterrent.
ちょっとスライドには入れなかったんですけれども、自民党の候補者が軒並み厳しいと言われるんですけれども、厳しいと言われる候補者には大きく3つの特徴があると考えています。
And this is something which is not included on the slides, but I would like to speak about some of the areas in which the LDP candidates are seen to be in rather a difficult position. In these cases, there are three particular characteristics.
1点目は週刊誌報道や政治と金の問題など不祥事が伝えられた議員です。
And the first is looking at those candidates where in the weekly journals or weekly magazines and so on, there has been reporting of scandals such as those to do with politics and money-related issues.
特に政治と金の問題に関しては、連立を組む公明党の支持を得にくいということから、軒並み公明党の支持を得られない候補者が出てきており、こういった候補者が小選挙区で落選する危険が高まっています。
And so within this issue, particularly in regards to the problems of politics and money connections as well, this is where it's rather difficult for Komeito supporters to be indeed still voting for these candidates. Therefore, we are seeing a likely loss of seats in some of the single state constituencies where these kind of issues are being reported.
2つ目に高齢の議員です。高齢の議員に関しても、高齢批判がこれまで非常に高まってきたことから、小選挙区で厳しい結果、また73歳以上は比例復活ができない原則がありますので、今回の選挙で引退になる議員も多く見られます。
The second point is about aging Diet members or aging candidates as well. We are seeing more criticism of more elderly or more advanced age candidates as well. And so it is rather difficult for them to be maintaining their seats. We are also seeing that it is more, or there is a trend for it more difficult to make a comeback in proportional seats for those who are more than 73 years old. Therefore, we may be seeing many more advanced age or older candidates and Diet members losing their seats in this election.
3点目は特に右傾化した議員です。
And the third is particularly those Diet members who have been leaning more toward the right.
総裁選挙で高市候補を支援した議員を中心に、中堅・若手の議員は右傾化することによって中間層・ミドルの層が取れないことで、得票を伸ばせないというそういった傾向が、予想されます。
And particularly, we saw in those Diet members who were supporting Ms. Takaichi in the LDP presidential campaign, we're seeing that there is a tendency from the younger Diet members and so on to be separating themselves more away from this and seeing that those who are more in the middle positioning are not likely to be voting for these candidates or these Diet members who are more right-leaning.
これまでの受けたお話しした3つのポイントに該当する議員の中には、党4役経験者や派閥の長も該当すると考えており、これらの候補者が落選することがあれば、自民党にとって非常にシンボリックな現象になると考えます。
And in regards to the Diet members who are relevant for these 3 points, which I have just mentioned, there are some indeed Diet members who form some of the 4 main positions within the LDP or who are also leaders or in significant positions within some of the LDP factions as well. Therefore, if some of these parliamentarians are to lose their seats, this will indeed be of great symbolic meaning for the LDP.
一方で自民党ないしは立憲民主党、私個人としては党の若返りが図れた政党こそが今後10年、20年の政権を担うことができる国民の信頼を得る政党になると考えていますので、こういった現象が自民党にとってプラスに働く側面もあると思います。
However, at the same time, I believe that the same thing could be said for both the LDP or the CDP, that the party who is able to maintain a younger presence within their party as well, or the presentation of the younger Diet members as well, will indeed have a significant position in regards to holding a position within government in the next 10 or 20 years as well, with more trust from the people and so on. So there is also a possibility that this may work in the favor of the LDP also.
最後にスライドの3番になります。
And I would like to speak about point 3 on my final slide.
コロナの影響は選挙にとても影響は少ないと見ています。
And I believe that the impact of COVID-19 on the election has been minimal.
感染者が減少傾向であることで、コロナに対する有権者の関心も低くなりつつあり、経済対策に有権者の関心は向きつつあります。
With the decrease in the number of COVID-19 cases in Japan, we are seeing less interest also in people, less priority being put on COVID-19 in regards to their priorities, and people's attention going more towards economic policies going forward.
はい、いずれにせよこのままコロナの感染拡大が起きないまま、選挙の現場でもコロナ感染が起きないことを願っています。
However, at the same time, of course, I very much hope that there will not be an increase in the number of COVID cases, and there will also not be any COVID cases and so on arising from within the election campaigning itself.
以上です。ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Oohamazaki-san. Okay, now, so we're going to open this up to Q&As. We have questions online, and also we have some questions coming from the room. And as always, if you have a question, please try to keep it short. And give your name and your affiliation, please. Okay, Richard. Yep.
Thank you. My name is Richard Tusilo from Indonesia, Tribune News, Tokyo Bureau Chief. I would like to ask Mr. Takayasu regarding the, is there a possibility merging between LDP, Komeito, and Ishinokai together, since you said that there will be a friction between Komeito and Ishinokai? That is one question. The second question, I don't know to whom, is about the economy. I believe there will be impact on the economy in Japan, whatever the result is. So one of you could explain to me, to us, what will be the impact of the economy in Japan after the election. Thank you.
インドネシアのテレビニュースの支局長のシュシロと申します。2点ほど質問があります。1点目は高安先生への質問なんですけれども、先ほど公明党と維新の会の関係についてのお話があったんですけれども、選挙の後に自民党、公明党、そして維新の会が連立政権を作るなどというような可能性があるのか、またその公明党と維新の会の今後の対立などはどのふうに見られているのかというのが1点目です。そして2点目がどなたでもということなんですけれども、経済についての質問です。選挙の結果がどうであれ、経済への影響はあると思うんですけれども、どのような影響が予想されるのかというのが2点目です。
はい、ありがとうございます。Q&A は日本語でさせていただきます。自民党、公明党と日本維新の会の連立の可能性ということなんですけど、これはもう数字の問題で、もし自民党、公明党で過半数にいかない場合にはあり得ることなんじゃないかというふうに思います。それが両サイドにとって望ましいことなのか、基本的に日本維新の会は政権の外にいることによって関係する人たちに利益をもたらしてきたということがあると思います。自民党は維新の会が外にいることによって野党の協力も得ている。日本維新の会は野党でいることによってこの政権と野党の間、その両方を批判することができると。で公明党は特に大阪で対立をしているわけですけれども、そこの関係があるので維新の会に入ってきてもらいたくない、当然自分たちの存在意義が低下するということになるわけなので入ってもらいたくないということで今のポジションをキープしているということなんだと思いますが、しかし先ほど申し上げましたように数で足りなくなればそういう事態もあり得るのではないかと思います。ここで閣外協力ということがあるのかどうかということまでは想像がつきません。
So thank you very much. I would like to respond in Japanese for the Q&A. As to the question of potential cooperation between LDP, Komeito, and Ishin Nakai, particularly in merging or forming a kind of coalition, I believe that this will come up to the numbers that we will be seeing as a result of the election. If it is not possible for the LDP and Komeito alone to have a majority, then indeed it is possible that they will seek this possibility. However, as to whether this is indeed desirable for both sides as well is rather a question. Ishin has been able to maintain or have their interests for the various people related and so on from their position being outside the government. That is indeed has something which has been working to their favor. Also for the purpose or for the side of the LDP, having Ishin on the outside of the government as an opposition party as well has been working in regards to having criticism being able to come from to both sides, shall we say, in that sense as well. When it comes to Komeito as well, of course, they are in conflict with Ishin in Osaka or up in tension against them as well. So for Komeito, they would not want Ishin to be part, indeed, of this cooperation. It would also lead to the meaning of their presence within the coalition also decreasing. So for Komeito, they would prefer to keep the current position and the current situation. However, as I mentioned, if Komeito and LDP are not able to gain sufficient seats in order to maintain a majority themselves, then potential cooperation with Ishin in the government is indeed a possibility. As to whether it would be, for example, cooperation outside of the cabinet and so on is a question which remains to be seen.
Okay, and the second question, the economy. So, Richard, could you just clarify your question on the economy, please? I mean, are you going to ask about the LDP after the election, or, I mean, what specifically do you want to ask about the economy?
経済についての質問を少し詳しく教えていただけますでしょうか。
Yes, for example, if there is a coalition between LDP, Komeito, and Ishinokai together, I believe everybody will surprised about this one also, because since you said there is friction between Komeito and Ishin, how come they make a coalition? And then how about the response of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the trading on the shares? Is there will be upside if they make a coalition, they make an increasing index, or they turn down, or I don't know. Thank you.
So in the case of a coalition between で経済についての方なんですけれども、先ほどの維新も含めたような連立政権がもし作られた場合の経済に対する影響についての質問です。そのような状況が生まれるのであれば、多分誰にとっても驚くことにはなると思うんですけれども、例えば東京の株式の市場などにどのような影響が予想されるのかということです。
We don't have an economist here, but who would like to ask that question?
皆さんは経済がご専門ではないんですけれども、もしこれについてお答えのある方がいらっしゃいましたらお願いします。
Any volunteers?
I'll make 2 quick points. The first, actually, following a little bit on what Takayasu Sensei said about the coalition that includes Ishin, this is something that has been deliberated really for the last, for much of the Abe, second Abe administration, particularly in relationship to constitutional revision. Having Ishin on board makes it much easier for the LDP to get 2/3 in the lower house, upper house, and but the LDP has never taken that step because of opposition or complaints from within Komeito. I suspect similar dynamics will continue after the election. But relating to the economy, assuming COVID is contained, I think Japan, much like many other countries, will see rapid economic growth over the next year or two. But one area where the parties differ, and so this isn't so much about Ishin, but differences across political parties and really on the left and right, is what to do about international travel. I think this is something that many of us have faced personally, of course, but tourism has been a big element of Prime Minister Abe's policies, and particularly tourism that goes outside of Tokyo to more rural areas, many of which have in some ways reconfigured their cities to build more hotels and transportation networks to facilitate travelers coming in. And so the closing off of international tourism travelers has very asymmetric impacts. By asymmetric, I mean it affects some regions more than others, and I think it affects rural areas more than others. So I think the LDP will move forward with deregulation as quickly as possible. But at least as of the moment, the main left-wing parties want to maintain stricter quarantine standards. I don't know if they'll keep that over the next few months or so, but I suspect that will be a big difference between who wins the election. And should the LDP lose, we may expect more hurdles for international travel.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Etienne Balmer. I'm a journalist of the French press agency. So I'm taking the scenario of a victory of the LDP on Sunday. So I want to, looking ahead beyond the general election, what would be the main risks that Mr. Kishida has really to look out in order to avoid ending like another revolving door prime minister? So would that be a resurgence of the COVID leading to a new state of emergency? Would that be his failure in failed promises from his side about the socio-economic reforms? Or would that be tensions within the LDP in case of a weak majority after the election, and also the next election, maybe a defeat or low victory at the next election at the upper house next summer? Thank you.
Okay. And is there any particular speaker you want to ask this to?
The more the better.
はい フランスの記者です。自民党がまた選挙で勝った場合のシナリオについての質問なんですけれども、その次に岸田さんにとってどのようなリスクが予想されるのか、どのような、また次の、すぐにまた首相が変わるような状況を避けるためにはどのようなリスクに注意すべきなのかということなんですけれども、例えばコロナの拡散がまた拡大して、また緊急事態宣言があることですとか、または岸田さんの社会経済的な約束が漏れないというようなことなのか、または自民党の中の、今回がもし議席がかなり失われるのであれば自民党の中のテンションなどというものがあるのか、または来年の参議院選などのことなんですけれども、どのようなことが岸田さんにとっての次のリスクとして注意すべきなのでしょうか。どなたでも大丈夫です。
それでは私最初に答えさせていただきます。先ほどの経済の問題とも絡むんですけれども、まずやはり大きいのは地方経済がきちんと回復していくのかっていうことだと思います。当面の政治的なスケジュールは来年の参院選ということになります。で地方のウェイトが大きいわけで、そこで、きちんとそこが回復してくるのかということですね。でもう一つ岸田さんのリスクというのは何を約束したのかがわからないということなんだと思います。これは総裁選でも今回の総選挙においても何をやると言ったのかがわからないということなんだと思います。でこれは先ほど申し上げたことと関連するんですけれども、その政策に対するスクルーティニー、あるいはこれまでの政権のパフォーマンスに対するリフレクションというのがきちんとなされていないので、どこを変えるのかどこを継続するのかはわからないのではないかと思います。一点おっしゃっているのはやはりその分配の問題ということなんですけれども、日本においての議論は分配、ディストリビューションと再分配、リディストリビューションの議論がぐちゃぐちゃになっていると。分配というのは基本的には経済主体が働いて、そして利益を上げたときにそれをどう分け合うのかという問題で、これは政府が持ち出しして支えるという類のものではないわけですね。企業の中でどうやって分け合うのかということで、企業の行動を規制するような何らかの政策というのが分配政策ということになってくるんだろうけれども、最低賃金を含めて特に何かおっしゃっているわけではないと。で、再分配の方に行っているんだけれども、ここにコミットをしているという様子は見られないと。でこれまでのパンデミックにおいてもそうなのですけれども、自民党の経済政策は基本的に業界単位で支援をするということであったと。でCOVID に対しては本来的には個人を支援するということが必要だったんだけれども、そういう政策ツールを持ち合わせていなかったために他の国に比べて支援することが困難だったんだというふうに思います。でこれから岸田さんが総裁選においてはアベノミクスの実際には問題点、限界点というのをはっきり指摘したがゆえに分配ということをおっしゃったわけなんですけれども、業界単位ではない支援、分配ということを本当に行うのかどうか、これ非常に不透明であるということだと思います。であるとすると、すみません。I'm so sorry. So sorry.
So I would like to first of all
Sorry.
respond to this. This is of course related to the economic question which we had before as well. What is very significant here is of course the economic recovery of the local or regional areas of Japan. The main schedule which is on the cards for this is the House of the election coming up next year as well in the House of Councillors there. And we are seeing that there is particularly of course a heavier weight on the regions, the local situation there in the election which is coming up next year. So how the economy will recover towards that is one particular schedule or timeline which is significant for Mr. Kishida. Another significant risk when we come at looking at Mr. Kishida is it's very difficult to indeed see actually what indeed he has promised in regards to policies as well. The same could be said for both the presidential election for the LDP and also in this current general election as well. But it is rather unclear as to what he has actually been saying that he will indeed be doing. This is related to the points which I shared in my initial remarks as well. but about the fact that there is indeed not sufficient scrutiny of policies or also opportunity for reflection or evaluation upon performance as well. The fact that this has not been done means it's difficult to indeed make any kind of evaluation as to what needs to be changed and what needs to be maintained or what should be continued from now as well. Another particular issue is that the fact of discussions on distribution and redistribution are indeed rather conflated in Japan. These are combined sort of in a way which is not necessarily as it should be. When it comes to the issue of distribution, this should be looking at, of course, how the different interests and so on are divided on the part of, by corporations and companies. This is not necessarily a position where it is the government which is taking the action specifically on that, but rather looking at what kind of, restrictions on the activities of corporations and so on, also looking at issues of minimum wage. However, this is not something which has been necessarily referred to or brought up within the discussion on distribution. However, when it comes also to redistribution, we are also not necessarily seeing any statements in regards to commitments for that as well. When it comes, for example, to the economic policies in regards to the pandemic of the LDP, we have seen a situation where what indeed was really needed was looking at support for people on the individual level. However, there is not, or they did not have the tools in their toolbox in order to be actually implementing this kind of work. So if we compare to other countries, for example, it was perhaps more difficult in the case of Japan to provide this kind of support as was perhaps more suitable for this situation as well as to compare more situation on an industry-based level. We saw in the LDP presidential campaign, Mr. Kishida also, spoke about, for example, some of the limitations or issues of Abenomics as well. However, we have the question about when it comes to the question of redistribution and so on as well, there are issues of rather lack of transparency in regards to this.
あと1点、エネルギー価格と輸入品のインフレリスクというのも他の国を見るとあるんじゃないかと思います。で、そうなるとこれは日本の場合にはこの金融政策に直結する問題でありますので、すぐに起きる問題ということではないですけれども、ケアしなければいけない問題かなと思っております。
And one more point to that as well is also looking at energy costs, and particularly when it comes to imports and so on, the risk of inflation in regards to this. And we can see this from the experience currently in other countries as well. In the case of Japan, this is directly related to monetary policy as well. Therefore, while this may not be something immediately on the cards, this is also an issue which requires care.
Yes, following up a little bit on what Takayasu said, I think in general the LDP does best in elections when the focus is on the economy, about macroeconomic policy, which has to do with technocratic skills and competence that's been built up over a long period in government. But I think in this election there's been a lot more attention, perhaps not the main focus, but certainly a lot of attention on social cultural issues about same surnames after marriage, whether that should be kept, as well as LGBTQ rights. And I agree with Takayasu that Prime Minister Kishida has not always been very clear about what he wants to do in terms of macroeconomic policy. But I think one thing that he stood out on was that it's very clear that the LDP is not very positive towards reforms that would move Japan towards a more progressive direction. I think including at the party leader debate held at FCCJ, he did not raise his hand in support. So it's not clear what he wants to do. It's somewhat clear what he doesn't want to do. And under Prime Minister Abe, Abenomics, economic growth as well as employment, a decline in youth unemployment meant that younger voters leaned towards the LDP. That's not on a value basis, but on an economic voting base. But should the LDP win fewer seats in this election? And should that be attributed to lower support among younger voters, then Kishida will have to decide what he's going to do after the election. Is he going to try to push and convince his party members that they're going to have to accept this, even though they've been opposed to it for much of their history?
Can I just quickly follow up to Oohamazaki Sensei, please?
Hi.
Just I've got a quick. Oh, you have a point to make
補足の
first?
質問もあるようなんです。もし先にお答えがあれば。
いいですか。じゃあ、そうですね、岸田さんが今回 高橋先生がおっしゃってた、何にコミットした選挙か分かんないという状態を作ってしまったのは、ひとえに時間的な問題があったと考えています。時間的な問題というのは、総裁選が終わってから総選挙までの時間が短かったことで、公約に対して党内でコンセンサスを取ることができなかったということです。ただ、これは実を言うと時間的な問題とも言い切れず、すなわちこの総選挙が終わった後、1月から始まる通常国会でさまざまな経済政策等々のですね、予算や法案やっていかなきゃいけないわけですけれども、これは非常に難航するというふうに私は考えています。その一つは派閥のパワーバランスが大きく変わる可能性があるということですね。派閥のパワーバランスが変わるということで、党内のコンセンサス、政調だとか総務会でのコンセンサスが取りにくくなるということ、特に総務会長は若い福田さんが総務会長になりましたので、そこに対してきちんと党内コンセンサスが取れるのかどうかというのは注目しています。そして参議院の選挙があります。この参議院、私は自民党非常に厳しい、今回の衆議院以上に厳しい結果になると現時点では予測しています。理由は2つ。1つ目は、参議院の選挙というのは全国区もあります。派閥や、先ほど話があった業界団体、組織内候補の選挙です。前回の参議院2019年も乱立しましたけれども、今回もやはり業界団体、コロナの影響を受けて自分たちの意見を通したいという強い要望があることから、11月に発表される2次公認、新人候補に関しては、多くの候補者が出ると予測しています。そして都市部ですね。
So I would like to also make a comment in regards to this. First of all, in regards to Mr. Kishida, as Professor Takayasu has said, indeed, it has not necessarily been clear about what indeed he is committing to. However, this is somewhat an issue of time. There was a very short period of time between the LDP presidential election and now this general election as well. Therefore, not necessarily sufficient time to gain internal policy consensus within the LDP prior to this election. However, this was also not only an issue of time as well. We can also see looking towards the regular diet sessions, which will begin sitting in January, where of course economic policy will be a significant focus then. They will be looking at towards different new budget and bills and so on to be on the table at that time. And I believe personally that there will indeed be significant difficulties faced at that time, particularly looking at gaining consensus within the LDP as well. There is a shift in the power balance between the factions in the LDP. Therefore, gaining this kind of internal party consensus will be even more difficult for Mr. Kishida in the time going forward as well, particularly when we look at Mr. Fukuda and so on, people being appointed in these new significant or seats within the LDP as well. I believe also looking towards the upper house elections to take place next year, there will be an even more difficult situation for the LDP in those elections than this current general election as well. There are two significant reasons for this. First of all is when it comes to the upper house, this is of course something on a national level, looking at the different electors on these levels as well, where the role of different industry associations and interest groups and so on is very prevalent. And we are seeing, for example, looking at the impacts of COVID on these different industry associations, their groups very much wanting their opinions, their requests and demands and so on to be reflected at this time will be a significant factor. And I think that in November, when we'll be seeing the announcement of candidates and so on in the secondary level for this as well, we'll be seeing many new candidates standing.
あと2つ目は、参議院の選挙というのは都道府県選挙区ですから、都道府県選挙区というのは必ず都市部が入ってきます。こういった都市部、静岡では野党共闘が成立しなかったにもかかわらず、自民党が負けた、これをどれだけ重く捉えられるかどうかというのも注目しています。最後にやはり申し上げたいのは、この岸田さんという人物は、岸田さんが影響を与えられる人というのは少ないけれども、岸田さんに影響を与えることができる人が多いというのが、極めて特徴的だなというふうに考えています。これが一番のリスクじゃないかというふうに思います。
And the second reason is when we look at the electors in the districts on the House of Council election happening next year as well. This is, of course, on the prefecture level as well. So if we look at the results from the recent or the supplementary or the by-election in Shizuoka, for example, we saw the case that even though there was no unified opposition candidate, the LDP did lose there as well. So I think this is quite significant because we see also the urban areas are included within the electors, within the constituents when it comes to the upper house elections next year. And the final point I would like to make as well is in regards to the largest risk for Mr. Kishida is indeed that the number of persons to whom Mr. Kishida himself can influence is rather few. However, the number of people who have influence on him is great. This is indeed the biggest risk for him.
Okay, Harry had a question?
フランスの公共ラジオ局と、リベラション新聞の特派員で西村と申します。今日、興味深い話ありがとうございます。一点お願いします。マスコミの影響力と役割について質問させていただきます。2009年の選挙の時にやはりマスコミは数週間前から政権交代のムードを作ったんじゃないかなと思われますが、今回はそういったムードはない。そもそもその可能性、政権交代の可能性がないからマスコミはそういうふうに報道してないことか、マスコミはそのムードを作ってないからその可能性がないか、どちらが正しいと思われますか？
My name is Nishida of French Radio and Newspaper. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations today. I have a question about the influence and also the role of the media. We saw the case in the 2009 election where from several weeks before the election, it seemed that the mainstream media, the mass media, was already creating a kind of mood for a change of government. However, we are not seeing that that is the case this time as well. But I would like to ask whether you think that it is the case that there is no possibility for the change of government, therefore the media is not reporting or is not creating this kind of atmosphere, or the reverse, because the media is ruling out this kind of possibility that indeed it is not a likelihood.
You would like to answer that question?
ではつなぎでお二人がお話をするまでどちらが先なのかっていうことは非常に難しいっていうことではないと思うんですけど、マスコミが政権交代を起こせるっていうことではないとは思います。でただそのマスメディアがその政党のその共通の土俵というんですか、先ほどレベルプレイングフィールドというふうに申し上げましたけど、それをきちんと作っているのかというと、そこは心配なところがあると。で例えばその政府の政策発表、政府の選挙後の方針というものは本来的にはこれは選挙報道の一部であるべきだと思うのですけれども、これは政府の政策であるという形で報道されると。でそれとは別に選挙ということがあって、そこでは自民党の未来の政策と野党の未来の政策が話されると。でその業績についてのスクルーティニーっていうのは非常に不足をしているということになるわけなんですよね。でそういうことで今ちょっと2つのことが一緒になっちゃいましたけれども、その片方でその政府与党ガバメントの側の情報発信っていうのはより多くやはり伝えられているのではないか。でそのガバメントとオポジションをともに同じ土俵に乗せてその過去を検証して、そして未来の実現能力あるいは政策の比較ということをしている場というのはこの10年で随分少なくなったというふうに思います。でそれがその一般の有権者のその政権交代可能性の認識ということに影響している、それが主たるものかは何とも言えませんけれども影響しているということはあるのかもしれないというふうに思います。
So I will respond first, just maybe to connect within this as well. I think it's not necessarily such a complicated situation, but I would say that it is not possible necessarily for the media directly itself to create a change in government. However, at the same time, within my opening remarks, I also spoke about whether there is indeed an equal or a level playing field for the different parties as well, and whether that has been created. And this is an area where I do have some concern. For example, if we look at the way that government policy is being reported, and this should be indeed reported as part of the election campaign reporting as to what kind of policies would be implemented, depending on the result of the elections. However, the way it is being reported as existing government policy as well means that there is not this separation between the current or the government reporting and the election campaign reporting there as well. Therefore, rather than having reporting on looking at the future policies of the LDP and the future policies of the opposition, there is this issue at hand there as well. I would also say that there is insufficient scrutiny in regards to what has actually been achieved or implemented through until now. So on the one side, we are indeed seeing that there is more information on the part or from the side of the government being conveyed or being disseminated through the media as well. So whether we can consider whether indeed the government and opposition are on the same level playing field in regards to their position and reporting within the media, and having this information being brought out onto that field in order to have consideration or comparison of policies, also looking at the feasibility of these policies in the future, I would say actually that situation has decreased within the past decade. And so whether indeed this is having some kind of an influence on the general voters, the general public, as to whether they have a sense of a possibility of a change in government is indeed it is a possibility.
Can I add a point on this? I find a massive difference between print and television media, within mass media, of course. As Oohamazaki-san was discussing regarding the election surveys, the major newspapers run surveys of the size that we don't see almost anywhere else in the world. Hundreds of thousands of people being surveyed, often repeatedly, and those filter into, of course, news articles on print media and their online editions. But they don't really make an appearance in television news, which is, of course, dominant, and print media receives less attention from younger voters. So as a result, if you only watch TV, you may not know much about how the election will turn out, but you'll almost certainly know where former Princess Mako went to get her international driver's license, which has been on TV quite a bit.
Hi. そのマスコミが政権交代を起こせるかどうかというところに関しては私も高安さんと同じでネガティブなんですけれども、ただ2つ申し上げたいことがあって、1つはこの総裁選挙でおけるメディアジャックと呼ばれる現象が間違いなく影響を及ぼしているというふうに思います。いわゆるどうせ岸田みたいなところがあって、岸田内閣が成立してからわずか数週間での選挙ですので、信任する材料も不信任する材料も持ってないというのが国民の今の状態だということ。そしてもう一つ、やはりメディアが政権交代の可能性について言わない大きな重要なポイントというのは、野党の中でもその政権交代と言っている人もいればですね、捕獲白昼を狙うというふうに明言している候補者も確実にということですよね。政権交代を狙っているというのが幾度すべて揃えばいいんですけれども、野党の候補者の中には捕獲白昼を狙うというふうに明言している方もいて、ゴールポストがもう議員によって野党の中でも多少違うというところ、この温度感が違う中で、やはり野党として政権交代を言っているということを、メディアがどんどん訴えるには、ちょっと野党の中での共通認識がずれちゃってるなというのがあります。これも一つ、そのマスメディアが政権交代というのをですね、強く言わない今理由なんじゃないかなというふうに私は考えています。
So I would also like to make a comment, first of all, as to whether the media can indeed affect a change in government. I have the same position of Professor Takayasu, saying that that is not necessarily the case. However, there are 2 points I would like to make in regards to that. The first is that when we come to the case of the general election, there is indeed this phenomenon of media jacking, which does have an impact on this. Particularly, we've also seen the case in this time where it's only a few weeks since Mr. Kishida has become Prime Minister, so therefore there is perhaps not sufficient material either to judge, either way in regards to his position and so on within how this is being presented. The second point as well about why it is the media that the media is not speaking so much of a possibility of a change in government is also there are factors within the opposition as well. There are those within the opposition who say very clearly that the goal is achieving a change of government or taking on the government. However, even within some of the candidates in the opposition, there are some who are not necessarily stating this as their goal, but see a different position there as well. So with a difference in the position of where even the opposition candidates themselves are placing this goalpost from the election, and a lack of consensus within the opposition as to whether it is actually the change in government that they are heading for or aiming for as well, is perhaps impacting or meaning that the media is also not necessarily speaking so much of this possibility of a change in government as well.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to a couple of online questions, and we only have about 10 minutes left, so I'll keep the questions short. If you could try to keep the answers quite short, please. First question is from Eric Johnson at the Japan Times. He talks about the arrangement between the CDP and the communists to field unified candidates seems, according to the polls, to be producing mixed results. What are your predictions for how many seats the unified opposition candidates will win and why? Maybe Oohamazaki sensei was best for that one. If you could translate, please, as well. Yeah.
はい、ではオンラインの方で届いている質問に行きたいと思います。まず一番最初はジャパンタイムズのエリック・ジョンソンから大浜崎先生の質問になります。今回のその立憲民主党と共産党の、統一の候補などについて、場所によってかなりどのような結果が予想されるのかという差があると思います。インパクトのあるところもあればそうじゃないようなところもあるように思うんですけれども、その統一の候補の、議席の予測というのはどのいうふうに今考えているのでしょうか。
立憲民主党と共産党の統一候補のこの野党共闘は、よくうまくいっているというふうに私は感じています。ただ、これが小選挙区で必ずしも勝てるかどうかというところに関しては、むしろ統一候補の成立がうまくいっているかよりも、自民党の候補者がそれに対応するだけの力を持っているかどうかにポイントがあると考えています。多くの野党共闘が成立した選挙区というのは、自民党の3回生まで、3期生までですと、その3回生までというのは、安倍総裁での選挙しか知らないんですね。今まで安倍さんのポスター貼ってきて安倍総裁の選挙しか知らない。そして野党共闘が初めて出てきてしまったときに、その対応力、機動力がある候補者かない候補者かで、この運命が分かれてくると思います。したがって、お尋ねの質問に関しては、統一候補、野党の統一候補、共産党と立憲党がくっついたことでうまくいくかどうかというのは、その2つの政党の勢いというよりも、自民党の候補者、与党の候補者が、その野党共闘に対応するだけの機動力をこの2、3週間できちんと対応できたかどうかという点に尽きると思います。
Thank you very much for the question. I personally do see that the cooperation in regards to the unified candidates between the CDP and JCP is going rather well. However, as to whether they can actually have success in winning seats in the single state constituencies, I think that this comes to, rather than the strength on the side of the opposition-backed unified candidates, it rather comes down to whether the LDP candidates in these constituencies have indeed the power or the capacity to stand up against these unified candidates as well. When we see in many of the different constituencies where there are these coordinated candidates, these are seats where the LDP member is in their, for their third term seats, which means that they have only experienced the election campaigns under Prime Minister Abe. They have, been putting up Mr. Abe's posters all the time. They have had Mr. Abe at the helm at the time of these elections. And this is their first time to be going into an election campaign with the opposition in this kind of different situation. So whether these LDP candidates indeed have the momentum or the capacity to stand up against these opposition unified candidates is indeed what will determine their fate. So I think that at the moment, rather than coming down to the capacity on the side of the unified opposition candidates, it rather does come to the side of whether the LDP candidate in the past 2 or 3 weeks has been able to gain that kind of momentum or capacity or not.
Okay. Thank you. I think now is a question here from Pio De Emilia from Sky TV in Italy, I think to Takayasu sensei. He asks about the Kyosanto and asks, is there still an anti-communist allergy in Japan? Obviously, we've seen the Jiminto calling them some very bad names over the last few weeks. In Western countries, the communists have long been recognized as a natural part of the democratic scenario. Why is this not happening in Japan? And do you think that this LDP's name-calling of the Communist Party is a sign that they are nervous about this election?
次はオンラインでイタリアのピオ・デ・ミリア記者からの質問です。こちらは高安先生への質問になります。日本でなぜ今まだ共産主義に対するアレルギーのようなものがまだ日本になぜあるのでしょうかということなんですけれども、特にここ数週間で自民党側から共産党に対しても非常にひどいような呼び方が見られるような状況があるんですけれども、欧米の多くの国ではその共産党というのは民主主義のシナリオの中の自然の一つの政党として見られてるんですけれども、日本の中のその反共産主義、反共産党のアレルギーはなぜまだ残っているのか、そしてその自民党がこのような悪いような呼び方などをしているということは、ある意味で恐れている、緊張しているようなことの象徴なのかでしょうか。
ありがとうございます。今回の選挙でむしろそういうことが確認されるのかもしれないというふうに思いますが、少なくともその日本共産党はその日本国憲法要するに反体制政党を言ってることからするとではないということである一方で、いやそうなのではないかということが繰り返し主張されていると。でただその際に当人たちがリスポンスする機会というのが少なくて、むしろその非難批判がイメージとして広がっていると。でむしろきちんと事実を確認するよりもそのイメージが広がるということが敵対する側からすると大事だということで、こうしたことというのは最近ではテレビのコメンテーターの方がそうしたことを流布しているということで問題になったりしたと。でその訂正の仕方についても問題があったのか否かということについて議論がございました。でそういう意味で日本共産党が政府にが受けている批判に対して広くリスポンスする機会というのが十分に、例えばこの選挙においても選挙期間が少なかったっていうのは、これは少なくした側には戦略的に大変に得であって、リスポンスする機会あるいは直接対決する機会というのを作らないことによって可能になったということなので、ちょっと長いですかね。
大丈夫です、もう少し。
よろしいですか。ちょっとだけこの選挙を通してむしろそういう認識が広がるという可能性もあると思います。他方で若い人はその共産党が何なのかということについては全然知らないと、むしろ護憲の政党で変わらない政党っていうイメージを持っているというようなことも、同僚の政治学者の研究などからは学ばせていただいています。
So I think that perhaps this election may indeed confirm such a situation here in Japan as well. At the very least, as to whether the Japanese Communist Party is indeed an anti-establishment party, of course, that is not necessarily the case. However, this is something which is repeatedly being brought up on question. One of the factors this time is as to whether they have indeed had sufficient opportunity to respond or to give any kind of response to this kind of criticism, as this image is indeed being spread about their party, is something which, well, this opportunity is perhaps even becoming less and less. So that, therefore, rather than an opportunity to confirm the facts or lay facts clear about this kind of issue, rather this kind of image spreading is something which has been developing further as well. There was, of course, a recent incident where a commentator on television made different statements which were raised as quite problematic in regards to toward the Communist Party, and then also the method in which a revision or a correction of these statements was made on television was then also brought into question, and there was significant debate about this as well. However, we've seen the situation as to whether the Communist Party has had enough opportunity to respond to this kind of criticism which is coming from the part of the government has indeed not necessarily been sufficient as well. This comes partially to the fact that the campaign period for this election has been very short, and this, of course, is something which is working in the favor of the side which decided upon this period of the campaign period as well, meaning that there is less chance or opportunity for response from the opposition or from the Communist Party, for example, as well. Therefore, we may see a situation where this kind of perspectives, this kind of situation will indeed be expanded further through this election. However, at the same time, when it comes to young people in Japan, I think it could be said that they do not necessarily even have any sense or an idea of what indeed the Japanese Communist Party is or stands for. Perhaps they see it as a party which is, wanting to protect the constitution and not making any changes at all within its party itself. But this is something that within some different research by political scholars and so on of young people we are seeing as a phenomenon or the situation.
一点ちょっとすみません、時間ないから申し訳ありません。共産党に対しては地方政治ではさまざまな形で与党として参加していたりするケースが戦後日本ではこれまでもありました。ただ1994年の非自民非共産連立政権の成立以降、特にその非自民勢力、その新進党であったり新政党であったり、あるいは民主党はその共産党と距離を取ろうとするその非自民非共産戦略というのをこの25年四半世紀取ってきたということ であると。その結果、その共産党と他の政党との間の距離、壁っていうのは非常に高くなってきたということはあるのかと思います。
And just to add one brief point in regards to this, there has been cases in post-war Japan where indeed the Communist Party has taken different positions within government in local politics or regional politics within Japan. However, since the 1994 situation where there was the platform of not LDP and not Communist Party as well, we are seeing with the different parties which are formed after that as well, based on indeed these factors, the Shinsei Party, the Democratic Party, and so on. There has been within these 25 years this tendency of placing a distance or deliberate distance from the Communist Party as well, which has resulted in perhaps a greater distance and also greater wall being built between the opposition parties and the Communist Party in regards to that, and that is also a factor to keep in mind.
Okay, if you keep your answer short, please.
なるべく簡潔で。
はい、現場の感覚で一つ思っていることを言わせていただきますと、自民党の総裁経験者とかが立憲共産党と批判すると、自民党の支持者はやや結晶化して、公明党のエンゲージメントは非常に高まっているんですけど、正直、若い無党派層は、その結果、日本維新の会に流れている傾向が見られます。実際に総裁経験者が立憲共産党かって叫んだところで、拍手しているのは、偏った右の人たちか公明党だけ、無党派層は大体ぼーっとして見てるだけっていう現象が現場だと感じられるので、そういったことも注視すべきかなと思います。
And so one further point to add to that in regards to the sense from actually on the ground in the election campaigning as well, we are seeing when former presidents of the LDP and so on are making these statements in regards to the Communist Party or about the cooperation, the coordination between the CDP and the JCP as well. We're seeing that while it is perhaps leading to more engagement from the Komeito side and so on as well, it is perhaps only on particular parts of the constituency where they are actually having any kind of engagement as a result of that. However, if it comes to younger voters, and particularly those who do not have any kind of party affiliation, these kind of statements are driving them more towards Ishin, and there is this tendency actually of having more support toward Ishin as a result of these kind of situation as well. So this is just something to share from the sense on the ground.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up there, but I'm going to end this with one question, very short one. How many seats will the LDP win on Sunday? Can you give your predictions, please?
最後に私から一つ皆さんに質問したいんですけど、日曜日に自民党は議席は何個取るのでしょうか。皆さん
Go first.
先にどなたにしましょうか。
ありがとうございます。先ほどのスライドで私は確か236と出した記憶がありますが、公示前の予測です。これよりはやや下がるのかと思います。単独過半数にはギリギリ届かないのかなという気がしています。ただ、その程度で233で230から236ぐらいというレンジも出していただければ、230から236ぐらいということにさせていただければと思います。
So in the slides I said at the time, just before the announcement of the election, I was predicting or forecasting 236 seats. At this point, I would say it will be somewhat less than that. I think they perhaps may just miss out on having the majority on their own account. So I would put my numbers perhaps between 230 to 236.
I support what he said.
Me too.
Okay, we'll start the press conference there. So, let's see what happens on Sunday.
Absolutely.
And just before we stop, I'm going to give you all a one-year honorary membership to the FCCJ. So come and have a drink with us at any time, with COVID or post-COVID or whatever COVID. Please come and do it. Okay, so happy assistance. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。Oohamazaki-san. どうもありがとうございました。Okay, round of applause, please. Thank you.